And so good afternoon and good evening to everyone from wherever everyone is joining and from the world and from wherever everyone is hearing this presentation. So my name is Adya. I work as an assistant professor with the GD Goenka University. And in today's keynote session, I would be speaking about communicating development narratives for Viksit Bharat 2047. So before we even get into the presentation, I would really want to express this insight, express this idea that, when we hear about the entire notion of Viksit Bharat, we often think of economic growth, infrastructural growth, we think of technological advancement, we think of, a digital innovation, a cultural innovation. And these ambitions and these thoughts are important for all of us to think in this direction for Viksit Bharat. But the question in this keynote presentation is that, what kind of development are we really communicating? What kind of, uh, development narratives are we really looking at? And who is included in the vision of development? And again, who remains invisible in the entire vision of development? So I've always been a scholar of environmental humanities. I've been a scholar of communication studies, and I believe that development is never only about economic growth, and it's always not only about economic projects, but development is also cultural, it is also social, it is also ethical, and it is definitely also communicative. So when we speak about what are the influencers to development and society, there are also a lot of other parameters, which are aligned with this. So with this, I would be moving to the next slide. The next slide is basically what is the entire vision of Viksit Bharat 2047. Now, development is not only, as I also said before, development is not only driven by, economic indicators, by government policies, but it is equally driven by stories, by communication, by public discourses, and definitely by the language through which we communicate these stories and, by the language through which we define success. So, as you can all see on the slide, this talks about a national vision, the core pillars and the pillar focus and the central question. This is again, it does not only examine communication as a medium of information, as a medium of dissemination of knowledge, but as a constitutive force. In other words, why communication does not simply describe reality, but it also creates reality by influencing beliefs, by influencing aspirations, and by definitely influencing the public discourse. Moving ahead to one second. Also, one point I missed in this slide, so I'm going to go back. If you all see the central keynote question in this, it says that beyond the GDP metrics, what should development fundamentally mean for 1.4 billion people and the ecosystems that are sustaining that kind of development? Moving forward with this, just allow me a moment. Yeah. This is basically why development narratives matter. Now, development is never value neutral. Now, we all know that, right? And every society tells stories about, what progress should look like and then what progress is at the other end of the spectrum. These stories often influence public imagination, political priorities, educational systems, media discourses, and eventually also, fortunately, unfortunately, our government policies. Now, when a society is repeatedly, it celebrates the, what's the best way to put it? Let's say, infrastructural, it celebrates highways, it celebrates industries, it celebrates skyscrapers and the GDP, and considers only these parameters as the sole, as the only growth, as the only sole indicators of success, as the only sole indicators of progress, there is a problem. Because in that context, then we are only looking at a material expansion. And this is the dominant narrative that, then shapes the modern development thinking. And inside of this narrative, nature is not often, viewed as anything for what it is, but it is often viewed as transactional. It is often viewed as a resource which has to be extracted, which has to be managed, which has to be exploited for the economic benefits. So as a result, what happens? All the forests, they become timber. All the rivers, they become water resources. All the animals, they become commodities, and all the land actually becomes real estate. And while these perspectives have definitely contributed to a lot of economic growth, not taking away from that fact, but they have also resulted in ecological crisis that we witness today, as you and I speak on, on this online call also. And environmental degradation is not just a matter, or it is, not just a reason of, let's say a poor economic policy, or, a poor policy, but it is also a very important factor of how stories that we have chosen to tell ourselves, stories that we have chosen to tell our previous generations and our next generations. Therefore, if we really, and if we genuinely aspire for sustainable development, we must firstly transform our developmental narratives. I will quickly move to this, which is communication as a constitutive force, right? One second. Yeah. Now, communication is often misunderstood as a tool for transmitting information after decisions have already been made. However, this is because I have always been a communication studies scholar my entire life, and I've tried looking at the entire spectrum of communication from, the space of public policy, from the space of environmental humanities, from so many different landforms and um, perspectives. And I have come to realize that communication scholars, we all increasingly argue that, communication creates meanings, it creates identities, it shapes institutions, it influences a social behavior, and ultimately it also produces the reality in itself. And before any road is built, before any environmental policy is stated, before anything, it also changes the behavior, it also changes a citizen behavior, if I were to say like that. So communication is the one thing which is always going to precede policy. And there are no two thoughts about this, because communication as a identity is always first, right? So by this entire thing, the next thing is that communication also influences how environmental problems are framed, whose voices are heard, which stakeholders are prioritized, and what forms of development appear legitimate. For example, if climate change is communicated merely as an environmental problem, if it's communicated just as a public engagement problem, that may be limited, right? But when climate change is communicated as an issue of public health, as an issue of economic security, as an issue of food systems, as a intergenerational justice issue, right? That is where we automatically start talking about the broader relevance of social, of environmental humanities, the broader relevance of also, if I may say, what constitutes Viksit Bharat as a whole, right? So if Viksit Bharat is communicated only and only through economic indicators, citizens will naturally prioritize economic outcomes. And if communication simultaneously highlights ecological responsibility, biodiversity, conservation, sustainable lifestyles, then those values also become a part of the national consciousness. And therefore, one of the very important things which I thought was also, very important to share is that communication should not just, merely publicize development. Communication as a tool should not exist in this world only to be publicizing that, this is development and that is development, but communication should actively design the future we aspire to create. Now moving to the next slide, which is basically environmental humanities framework. This term, so I would just quickly take a minute to engage with the entire term, of environmental humanities. Environmental humanities, I would not say it's a very new term in India, but like a lot of research has not been done so far, in this entire domain. And Environmental humanities is basically an interdisciplinary field, that brings together literature, philosophy, history, cultural studies, communication studies, ethics, environmental studies, to understand the complex relationship between humans and the natural world, right? So, unlike the traditional environmental science, which primarily used to explain ecological problems through data, through science, through scientific evidence, environmental humanities takes on to very different questions, by the way. And the foremost question that environmental humanities ask is, why do environmental crises continue despite scientific knowledge, right? Why do societies knowingly engage in unsustainable practices? And the answer is often not in a lack of information, because these are the times, when we are living, and no one is really living, in a lack of information era, right? But again, it is in our cultural values, it is in our narratives, and it is definitely in our ethical frameworks, right? So the answer often, again, is not a lack of information, but in our cultural values, narratives, and ethical frameworks. Environmental humanities, therefore, shifts our focus, and I am going to read this out. Environmental humanities shifts our focus from simply solving environmental problems to understanding how human beliefs, stories, and worldviews, perspectives create these problems in the first place. And one of the most important contributions is challenge, challenging the entire notion of anthropocentrism. This is the first thing which is also written on my slide. I will quickly walk us all through the meaning of this term. Anthropocentrism is the belief that human beings occupy the center of all moral and development concerns, that human beings are at the top of the hierarchy, right? And instead, it also encourages us to recognize that humans exist within interconnected ecological systems where our well being depends upon healthy forests, rivers, biodiversity, climate stability, and countless other species. The second definition that I've given is challenging anthropocentrism, or not believing that we are, going to function in an anthropocentric framework while we discuss environmental humanities framework. So this perspective also promotes ecological ethics by reminding us that technological advancement should not be separated from moral responsibility. Finally, environmental humanities connects scientific evidence with human values. Facts alone rarely challenge behavior, right? Stories, education, culture, communication transform facts into meaningful public behavior. I am going to, okay, reimagining development paradigms. This is going to be important. This is going to be a, oh, yeah. If you just look into the slide, now these slides compare two very different ways of understanding development. The first is the traditional development paradigm that has dominated much of the 20th century. And within this model, nature is viewed primarily as a resource. Again, forests, become timber, rivers become, for industrial use, land is for construction or real estate, and progress is measured by increasing production, consumption, and GDP. Although this approach has contributed significantly to economic growth, but it has also resulted in climate change and biodiversity loss, pollution, habitat deconstruction, and the list is endless. Environmental humanities proposes an alternative. There is a need, why such discussions are coming through scholars of environmental humanities. And while all kinds of researches are very important in India today, but I also feel that, while we all are moving towards the vision of attaining a Viksit Bharat, the entire vision of environmental humanities should not be left behind. So, environmental humanities proposes an alternative. We are saying that instead of treating nature as an object to dominate, it encourages us to view nature as a partner in development, right? Human prosperity and ecological health are not competing goals, they are mutually dependent on each other. While ecosystems remain healthy, agriculture becomes resilient, cities become more livable, economies become more sustainable, and communities become healthier. The concept of more than human futures expands this perspective, expands the perspective of environmental humanities. And development should not only improve human lives for sure, but should also create spaces where wildlife, where biodiversity and ecosystems can continue to flourish. Therefore, reimagining development does not mean rejecting our first traditional paradigm of success, our first traditional paradigm of economic progress, but it definitely means redefining progress in itself so that economic prosperity strengthens ecological resilience instead of undermining it. The next slide is human animal studies and multi species justice. Now, this entire talk, this entire keynote has touched on, a lot of things, and this is one of the last pillars, that is, really important for all of us to understand. This field, the entire field of human animal studies, by the way, this entire field is, again, it's a subpart of environmental humanities, right? This field asks us to reconsider one of the most overlooked dimensions of development, that is our relationship with the non human world. And traditionally, development policies evaluate success by examining benefits from human population, right? However, human animal studies or environmental humanities asks a very important and asks a very ethical question. And that question is, who else is affected by development? Who else is going to be affected by the development that we reach in 2047 on the name of Viksit Bharat? Large infrastructure projects, highways, industrial corridors, mining, rapid urbanization, fragmented lifestyle, etc. These are all consequences, which are described as environmental side effects. So this is one of the most important thing. Now, coming to the next slide, which is basically communication for sustainable futures, right? Now, in this entire talk, I have listed four basic frameworks. One is ecological literacy, one is participation, one is indigenous knowledge, and one is behavioral shift. Ecological literacy is basically, if you guys read, it's basically cultivating public understanding of environmental ethics through media, literature, and educational curriculum. Citizen participation is fostering democratic dialogue with local communities, actively negotiating development priorities. Why are we even discussing all these four things? Why are we discussing ecological literacy, citizen participation, indigenous knowledge, and behavioral shift? Could be a question to many, but the answer is very simple. When we are talking about Viksit Bharat, when we're talking about a developed nation, when we're talking about the vision of our country, we cannot be onto this vision, just by prioritizing, the space of infrastructure. We have to also be on this vision by prioritizing the space of human infrastructure. How will human infrastructure come into existence? Human infrastructure is going to come into existence. This is the slide. Human infrastructure is going to come into existence when all of these things are put together, when our focus is not just only on the material wealth, on the material health and the material wealth of the nation, but when our focus is also on shifting the narrative. Shifting the narrative then towards what becomes the next most important question. And my response to that would be that shifting the narrative towards the environment, because again, one of the most important and unaddressed question in India today is, while everyone is talking about Viksit Bharat, everyone is talking about a vision, but who is actually, what are the questions that, are coming out of it? The entire vision of Viksit Bharat should definitely benefit a source of population or should definitely benefit a couple of people. What are these structures that we are talking about? We are only talking about a benefit of the human population. And humans and non humans have existed since centuries before even you and I were born and will continue to exist. So, if we look at envisioning Viksit Bharat, we speak about ecological resilience, inclusive growth, multi species well being, ethical governance, climate consciousness. And this basically is that a truly developed India grows with nature, not at the expense of nature. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'm running out of
Thank you.
time.
No, thank you so much, ma'am. What a wonderful presentation, ma'am. Very nice concept. Even this one